Hi everyone! Today's video we're going to be talking about button molds, those things on the inside of your buttons. At the end of the video I'm also going to be showing a selection of our community contributions to the One Button a Week 2022 challenge for week 2, which is winter. So let's get started. Let's talk button molds today. It's something that came up in our Facebook group along with the One Button a Week 2022 challenge, and that is partially what is a button mold and where can I find them. A button mold is basically the form of your button. So what is inside? Now that could be anything from a bit of wood, a bit of bone, a bit of plastic. This would also include any of your cover buttons that have already been covered with fabric and so on. Basically, it's the inside form that gives structure. Using the term mold tends to come about in the same way as a tassel mold, so therefore the former inside. Not everyone uses that term, but that is the term that we use, for instance, on our web shop and so on, and I use in all of my videos. It just makes it easier. So the next thing is where can you get them? What can you use as a substitute? Now, traditionally, a lot of button molds were made of wood. This has a really long history. Your earliest button molds are made of wood. I have such a lovely collection. Anywhere that I can sort of pick them up, I do. They come in very handy when I'm doing costume, for instance, and I just need a few buttons of a particular shape or size. It's really great when you sort of collect these up. And you'll notice that they have a single central hole, not at all like we expect from buttons. This is primarily due to the way in which they're made. Button molds are made either by turning, and so they're held on a lathe and they effectively will turn like sections like that, one big section. And so they'll create a curve and then another curve and another curve, and then they'll saw these out. And part of the point of a central hole is you have, with the machines, with the lathe, they hold top and bottom, so then they just drill through, it's easier. The other way that a lot of button molds were made is by drilling, and it's the same way as beads are made. And you can see here that these are a drilled bead, so a drilled mold. And basically what you have are two molds for your drill, and you drill down into the wood. I'm just going to draw this up actually. So if you were to say sort of like that is one drill bit, they drill down into the piece of wood, but they have a little hole there usually to help center it. So that will cut out that curve bit. Then they flip over the piece of wood and they drill the other side. And when you see something like this on an old button mold, you can see there's a bit of a seam, like a join. That will have been drilled using a drill bit. And they're specially made drill bits for this purpose. And today you can still get specially turned button molds, and the turned ones include things like this with little beads. They're all little turned ones that we've had specially made for your smaller, more delicate button molds. And then for your more traditional 18th century Victorian button molds, we've got a variety of sizes here that, again, these are all hand turned. Then you can get your, traditionally you would get bone molds. So here's a variety of old bone molds. As you can see, same process is turned, drilled as well, which is where you get this little seam here. So a lot of the rings, the very old bone rings, you'll see this, the seam on that. And as you can see, some of them have larger holes than others. The size of the hole doesn't always matter, although with studying some buttons, you can see that if they do have a larger hole, they can be made into different types of button. So that can hold a little bit of sway. We also had a series of tagua nut molds specially made so that we could get some of these more domed shapes. So again, same thing, looking at the inside of the button mold. However, that it doesn't stop there. Other button molds, you can use balls of fabric, you can use beads, you can use rings of fabric, you can use toggles and shapes of fabric. So you've got a lot of options there as well, particularly with the smaller button molds, that you can use all sorts. You can use paper beads. They're really good if you want to fill in the center of a knot, for instance. They work really well. You can use pieces of leather. You do usually need, well, it depends on the thickness of the leather, really, how well that works for you. You can use discs of plastic. You can use discs of card. I know a lot of people will cut them out of heavyweight card, but you can also, particularly if you have a hole punch or you have a die cutting machine, you can cut out circles and glue them together so that you have a bit of stiffness. You can also use heavyweight interfacing. So what here in the UK is often called pelmet interfacing, even though not many people have pelmets anymore. It's a heavy duty type of plastic used in sewing. That works really good. I used that for quite a few button molds in my fabric buttons book. Again, because it's accessible. You know, if you've got sewing place around, chances are you will be able to get hold of it. And you can also do different shapes with it. And speaking of shapes, of course, then you have specialist shapes. So for instance, we have a lot of specialist shapes that I've developed over the years. Some are based on sort of your historical things. Some are based on, oh, look, that would be nice. Let's see if that will work with a button making technique. And some entirely different, like our landscape rings. And that is something that we are always developing, primarily because I'm always experimenting on what I want for a button. You can also use cork. I'm not going to take this apart, but I can show you just that is cork inside. This is one of the first buttons I ever made, and I couldn't get button molds. There wasn't any place on the internet to order them, that's for sure, back then. And so that's why I'm not taking this one apart. But as you can see, the nice thing about a cork is you're slicing it down, but you know that it's got a nice round profile. So, you know, for your death's heads and your wrapped buttons, that is really handy. And the added thing that it's actually quite lightweight. So they're quite nice to use for buttons. Then you've also got combination. So you can stack buttons. You can, something like this. I have two MDF circles, and I have glued a tagua nut dome over it to give me a really high domed shape. And you can do that with rings, for instance. So you can stack up rings to create different profiles, and that works really well. Glue those together. You can stack up different sizes of your circles, and you can sand the edges off. So if you're using a heavy, like a mat board type of card, you can actually sand off the edges of that to give a little bit of a rounded profile if you want. So there's another option for you. You can use regular buttons. I only have to hand these, but you can see they've got a really deep profile. So in of themselves, if I wanted to drill a single hole in the center, I could do some pretty cool things with this button just as it is, but you could also make that into a combination button as well. The other thing you can do, though, if you want to use this for instance, a death's head, use the back. Use that smooth side, because most buttons, most manufactured buttons, and this goes for plastic buttons and so on, have a smooth back, regardless of what's at the front. So if you flip it over, you will get the same sort of profile that you need for a basic wrapped button. You can drill a small hole. You could, if you wish, leave it. Just be careful about which designs you choose. I know that the second thing after using a lot of cork that I ever used were these toy parts. And as you can see, they do not have a central hole. And you sort of learn to adapt and decide what designs you're going to use. Not all of them require that central hole. Death's heads, it's a good idea if you do have it, just so that you can sort of catch that last thread. But if your wrapping's really good, you don't always need to. And we then can talk about rings. So again, you saw a few of the antique bone rings, but for a modern day, well, you've got just as many different choices. What you have to do with a ring is make sure that it's closed. So a jump ring that opens is no good. I have been known to try to seal a join in a jump ring when I've looked for a particular size or profile, but I wouldn't recommend that. It does make it quite difficult, really, in the long run. Curtain rings. That's the most obvious, and a lot of people will use curtain rings. Now, the nice thing about curtain rings is that they do tend to be plastic. Now, clearly, this rounded edge that the plastic rings have lends a certain thing to the button and to the button design. And so again, that's another thing that you have to bear in mind. It's no different than whether you have a domed or a flat button mold. Other types of modern curtain rings are also hollow brass. You'll often see hollow brass rings, but they are getting a lot more difficult to get in different sizes. They're tending to be nowadays sort of 2 or 3 sizes. And what usually happens with a hollow brass is you can see a seam along the back, and that makes that a lightweight rather than if you had a solid brass ring. You can use solid brass rings and rings that, for instance, you use in handbags and so on, but they can be very heavy. So you have to take a look and think about what you're using that on. If you're using it as a decorative button, say on a big bag, then it probably doesn't matter. But obviously you're not going to really use it for a garment. You've got small, these are Roman blind rings, these very small ones. They're great for making little buttons, you know, just your little cardigan buttons and so on that you just want a little extra. The jewelry rings are nice because you can often get very, very fine profiles. And that's more in keeping with your traditional Dorset buttons. They would have had a very, very fine ring. And in fact, every once in a while, I get hold of some that have been handmade and soldered, and they're really lovely. But they do take, you know, clearly, they're a bit harder to get hold of. But you can find closed jump rings quite a bit. And they will often have small profiles. So it's just a matter of, you know, seeing what you can find. These are washers, and they're great for your Zwern styles because they have a flat edge. You can also, I mean, we also do a whole range of concentric MDF and acrylic rings, so that you've got a sort of a choice of different sizes as well. And again, obviously they're flat, so the profile there is a flat edge as opposed to the rounded edge of the plastic rings. And of course, depending on fashion, you can find jump rings and jewelry findings that are shaped. So for instance, hearts, ovals. At the moment, I know quite a few people are getting rings that have little fluted edges, scalloped edges, and they look great, made up into Dorset buttons. And it just really depends on, things like that tend to depend on fashion because they are part of the jewelry. So if you see something that you really like, I would advise you to stock up on them, because sometimes these things aren't made the next year and you're sort of stuck with them, or one or two of them when you wanted 10 of them. So it's always a good idea to check, you know, from there what you can get. But as you can see, that all creates different types of profiles. And as I said, you can use fabric or thread rings. These tend to work better on a small scale, clearly because they aren't as stiff, but you can also use other soft stuffing. So a felt ball, that can work well in certain types of buttons. I did say about the fabric balls. Another thing that I do, particularly when I'm trying to work out something that should be a very, very small button, is I will literally make a ball of string. It gives me a nice support, allows me to work in larger threads and figure out a design and that I'm happy with it. But it also has enough firmness, if I make a nice firm ball of string, to give me a button mold. Let's see, what else? Other shapes that you can make with fabric. Our button template set has got all instructions so that you can make sort of toggle shapes, firm beads, different types of toggles there. And so you can see that there are other things that you can make to put inside of a button mold. The other option, of course, is self-cover buttons. And self-cover buttons are great if you're doing embroidered designs. You can either cover the button before or after you've worked embroidery, depending on the embroidery you want to work. Obviously, if it's very, very intricate embroidery, you'll want to do it first. But most modern types have an outer ring and an inner, which, let's get the right size here so that you can actually see what I'm talking about. And then that would snap in after this is covered with fabric, snap in there to hold the fabric in place. So that's a really good option. And if you want to do any of the the sort of lace stitches, you could cover with fabric first and then work the stitches over the top. So that gives you some nice domed shapes. And again, this is something that you can Frankenstein, as it were, because you can put them together to make other button molds. So you could put that together like so, and then cover the whole thing. You can actually get some really terrific shapes if you stop and think about what goes together and what can be glued together. I absolutely love doing that. We actually also have series of rings and buttons that you can stack and glue together for the different soutache buttons, because they tend to be on quite domed plastic molds, and you need machines to put those together normally. So again, by stacking up and creating combination or Frankenstein molds, you can get the right profile. You could also use cover buttons with an actual machine, but of course you have to get the machine. So that's possibly, you know, you have to know that you want to do that, but basically the machine will, it's a big machine. Well, it's not that massive, but it's too big to put underneath the camera here. And they usually have a hand lever, and they're like cast iron, and you have your button molds in your dies in two halves. So the dies go through and then push together with the spring. You put your button mold in one side, and which is the top of the button mold, into one side, and then you put with your fabric, and then you put your back in and press them together with the weight of the machine to seal it. And so that would then seal in your fabric. Now, the other thing is that these pieces can also be used for certain types of buttons. So all of the time, what you have to do is think about what it is that you want. Think about the profile that you want. Most people will want rings or discs. That's going to be the big thing. And so whilst rings are harder to make on your own, curtain rings, jewelry findings, you should be able to pick up all sorts of things like that in your local stores. And discs, well, discs are easy enough to cut from plastic or cardboard, build them up. Now, I hear people saying, but wood, oh, I can't wash it. No, you can't. But any of the old buttons wouldn't have been washed either. In fact, a lot of antique buttons, whether they were fabric or not, should never be immersed in water, because they are still of themselves composite buttons. So they will often have cardboard inside of them to help hold certain pieces tight. And so you would just ruin your button. Or they'll be made of something that if they're immersed will rust, or the colors will go. And so those sorts of buttons should be removed before a garment is immersed in water. And frankly, you know, you're going to spend all of this time on something. You do need to think about that aspect. If you really want to make a button that can be washed, I would recommend making either a firm ring button, and bear in mind that you can, particularly with rings like this, you can wrap a death's head on a ring. It's harder to stay together, and you will have to secure that central part, but you can secure that central part. In fact, you can put extra weaving in it because you can get into there. So that is an aspect. If you're thread wrapping any button that you want to put in the wash, you must take care to make sure that everything is secure, as well as your button mold being washable. Now here's a little something that I've had for years and years and years, and every once in a while I throw it into the wash with another new button on it. Now, I have actually used here, that is a plastic button, upside down. So cotton thread, it's been washed a few times, it's starting to fade a little bit around the edges, but I know that my weave was tight enough that it doesn't matter. It's been washed and dried actually. And the same with these plastic buttons or bone buttons. So you can do it and it can work. Here, ring buttons, trying out different things. Now you see, if you use certain detergents with brass, it can, when exposed to air, just give a little bit of a greenish tinge. So you do have to take care on that as well. But as you can see, if you work it strong enough, your metal rings usually withstand a little bit better. And here, some Yorkshire buttons that have gone through the wash, and they are just soft, firm fabric shapes inside. So a few times in the wash, they tend to hold up pretty well. And that's also a good thing to do. Take an old face cloth, do a trial, throw it in your wash, see if it survives. Then you've at least got an indication of whether what you intend to do is worth doing for that particular garment. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the week 2 contributions for one button a week, 2022, and that is the winter contributions. And do please remember to like and subscribe. It all helps the channel. This is just a selection, and these are from photos that were uploaded to our Facebook group and permission given to use them or emailed to me. Any of you taking part on Instagram, I am sharing those images that are tagged One Button a Week 2022 in my stories so that people can see them from there. So do check out over on Instagram as well, because there's even more. All of these lovely contributions, thank you so much to everyone who is taking part, and to those of you who have said that I can go ahead and make up these collages of images. It's so inspiring to see what everyone is doing. The next week's challenge is stripes, which is actually sort of the week that as I am talking to you. So obviously I'm doing the roundup the week previous. So next video that you'll see will have contributions for stripes. And then week 4 is texture. Do check out my blog on onebuttonaweek.co.uk, and you can find the whole list of the prompts if you want to take part. Thanks ever so much for watching. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.